Are you pessimistic about the role of the critic today?
I'm pessimistic about so much, but not about criticism. There's this beautiful moment, I think in the Said text in The Anti-Aesthetic, which is that, people will always be drawn to think critically because they will want to think a different relation to the present, a different possibility for the future. And it's why people become artists too. They want to think in an alternative way. I don't see an end of criticism.
Hi, I'm David Velasco. I'm the editor-in-chief of Artforum magazine, and today I'm speaking with Hal Foster, who has written a piece for us on the anti-aesthetic at 40. It's an incredible essay revisiting a book that he edited in 1983. Thank you for having us in your beautiful home that you've lived in for 38 years.
Ever since the anti-aesthetic, almost.
Did selling the anti-aesthetic allow you to buy this fabulous apartment?
Yeah. Huge royalties.
I like that idea that criticism offers us alternative paths, other criteria, as I guess Leo Steinberg put it. But
yeah, and I think for me another really important dimension of criticism is the utopian. That has a bad name these days, but I think it's actually really important these days to insist on the utopian dimension of art, the utopian dimension of criticism, precisely in that mode of to think other, to think alternative, to think kind of an open space. In part because everything else is so dark. I'm not pessimistic about criticism or about art.
in the piece that you wrote for us, you actually talk about how the making of the anti-aesthetic formed in the urgency and contingency of the moment. And I wonder if you could actually trace what that moment was for you. What were you doing and who were you talking to in the early 80s that led to you thinking that this was a good idea?
Well, I was at Art in America as an editor along with Craig Owens. And that was an important relationship for me because we talked every day, much of the day. And we were in this moment of kind of mad assimilation, mad absorption of new work, new theory. And we, came to fall in with the same group of artists and critics. So obviously, primarily that was the pictures group. So it's really out of conversations with Craig and other critics like Douglas Krimp, Rosalind Krauss, who was the teacher of Craig and Douglas at that point, and then later me too. She was part of it as well. But there's a funny way in which the information flowed in both directions. I mean, I think Rosalind learned from Douglas and Craig too, especially about contemporary practice. So that was, the art side, the critical side, but there was a whole theoretical side too. I mean, I studied at Columbia and worked with Edward Said and got to know Sylvain Lottinger, and so the semiotext world was part of my world, and so it was a time of new art, new theory. So we thought new criticism. We needed a new way to connect art and theory and history through new critical models. So we didn't really have any. So we wanted to think about how we could invent them. But yeah, it was just a classic New York story where people come together, often thrown together, and find affinities and find a conversation.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I love this city, and it remains somehow, for whatever reason, despite the the vicious vagaries of the real estate market, it remains a place where a lot of interesting people get thrown together and have to make sense of their meetings.
Yeah, I totally agree.
It's interesting to hear you talk about who you were running around with, where who you met at that time, and it reminds me also of a point in your piece where you talk about how postmodernism wasn't born in the academy, even though it came to live there. Your book, The Anti-Aesthetic, was published by a small press, an independent press, and it wasn't until I think later that it was brought into the academic realm. I was curious if you could just talk a little bit about what that meant.
Well, it meant a couple of things. We really thought that we were a vanguard. There was a way in which, at that time, criticism theory was the avant-garde as far as many of us were concerned. So it made complete sense that it wouldn't be taken up in the academy. Contemporary art wasn't a field yet either. So neither critical theory nor contemporary art were really in the academy. In fact, the academy was hostile to both. And it was only in certain places, certain people really, that wasn't true. And Columbia just happened to be one. And that's one reason why we gravitated there. I mean, the Graduate Center at CUNY was another place too. It's also really important that at that point you could still be an independent critic. You didn't have to depend on the academy as a way to survive. Through magazines, museums, you could get by. And it was just also a cheaper time. We were young, and New York wasn't so expensive.
You began the piece for us with it's almost on a melancholic note, kind of speaking to the fact that, as you put it, postmodernism today seems like an anti-aphrodisiac of the just past, and modernism feels, as dominant as ever. Do you personally feel more of an alignment with modernism these days, or do you find yourself also pursuing some of these kinds of ideals of the Enlightenment?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. In a way, I think I've aged out of contemporary art, but I was trained as a modernist, identify as a modernist. It's what I teach primarily. But there's a way, I think, in which modernism is a lively topic again, because we want to think about questions of, well, not only globality, but diaspora, for example, and to kind of remap modernism in other places and not do so in terms of, original and belated or center and periphery, but to, just come up with a different chart. So, in a funny way, at least to me, the field feels lively again. Whereas I think with postmodernism, the problem fairly early on was that it was captured by, dare I say, the culture industry. It became a term of style, which it never was for me, quite quickly, and it became a meme, such that it, whatever critical valence it had, tended to drop away. I would like to see the term rethought. I suppose I sided then, and maybe still, with Frederick Jameson, how he used the term, which was really to think about how to historicize culture in relation to capitalism, to think about how art in particular not only responds, but intervenes in particular socioeconomic, political conditions. That for me was the most important project of the book. But the term was just taken over as a stylistic one, and then it became a kind of cliche of fashion, of food, and everything else. So,
when you teach a class on modernism and postmodernism, as I know you do, what do you actually come in armed with definitions of modernism and postmodernism to give to students?
not anymore. I mean, the trick really is to think it anew somehow and see what it means to them. I mean, that's the starting point. But for us, I mean, we were, by and large, young then. So there was a generational revolt that really drove the conversation about postmodernism. And so there was a particular idea of modernism that we had in mind that we wanted to displace. And of course, that was the old Greenbergian one, Anglo-American model of, formless criticism, where the medium is all. But it wasn't, our idea of postmodernism wasn't anti-modernist. It was a way to open up the field of modernism to all the modernisms that existed within it, that one definition of modernism had dropped to the side. So, I mean, I think this is lost a little bit now, and maybe even then. The project was as much to recover modernisms as it was to break with them. But then again, we were young, somewhat apocalyptic. Derrida talked about the apocalyptic tone in critical theory. We drank that Kool-Aid. So we declared the end of this, that, and the other thing fairly readily. Now, one finds continuities, but for us then, it was really important to make distinctions and even to draw discontinuities. That was part of the project too.
This opening up is, I kind of want to link it to something else you say in the essay, which is you're talking to somebody an editor at Social Text, I believe, who says that these critical journals are the political parties of our time, and this makes you very sad, understandably.
When that was said to me, that critical journals are the political parties of our time, it didn't strike me as crazy. It did, again, it was like, whoa, funny, sad, pathetic, but not crazy, because there was real political energy in critical theory at this time. But there's so many ruses of reason, as Hegel would say, ruses of history. That idea that there could be a postmodernism of resistance that would take on this postmodernism of reaction that we saw all around us. That it wasn't a mistake, but we had hopes that weren't borne out. And we have to remember that this is in the very early days, at least in this country, of neoliberalism, the deregulation of everything. It was also the moment when there was neoliberalism in the economy and neoconservatism in the culture. So it was this very intense alliance where, on the one hand, the economy was deregulated, but everything else was, back to the past, back to tradition, the family, remember moral values. And that seemed to be carried through in the postmodernism that we saw as reactionary, the kind of return to figurative painting, to ornamental architecture. I mean, that was really the cultural, political debate.
I think that's something that's really exciting about your return to, which, I mean, it's a very interesting piece. I don't think it's rare that a writer revisits something so directly that they did 40 years ago. And it wasn't until I was reading the text again that I thought, in some ways, a piece like this figures actually, it's my ideal of like what a reparative criticism would be. It's something that in fact is returning and saying like, what can we proceed with from these earlier ideas?
You know, we've talked about this question of the reparative before. I think my reaction is a little bit too reactive to the term, because for me, one of the crucial texts is the Culture of Redemption by Leo Bersani, which is quite critical of the way in which we look to culture for redemption, really, to make us whole again. And, you know, what does that desire, what does that wish say about how we view our lives, our experiences, as always somehow broken? Or so part of my resistance to the reparative is that it sets up an idea that we're already fallen or already deep in a traumatic view of history, of life. And I want to think out of that opposition of the traumatic and the reparative. But yeah, to look back and to think about what can be recovered and what needs to be done still, I guess that's reparative too, and I'm down with that.
To me, the thing that, the reason that I like continue to kind of use the word reparative in the way that I do is as a way of thinking against paranoia, which I think is like a very, to me is like the most damaging and disintegrating positionality in culture today. I mean, you see it everywhere, the kind of feeding into conspiracy theories, the distrust in not just, criticality of institutions, which is of course, I think like necessary, but this, utter distrust in any kind of institution or any kind of normativity.
No, I get it, and I totally agree. I mean, there's this great old text by, I think, Richard Hofstadter about the paranoid style of American politics. It goes back to the Goldwater days. It's with us like mad, of course, today. But there's another discourse on paranoia. I mean, one of my favorite definitions of paranoia comes from Philip K. Dick, who said that the paranoiac is the person with all the facts. So, and even Freud, he said the great philosophical models are paranoid. I mean, to propose a total view of the world is a paranoid act.
But I think I do share with you certainly a phobia of a culture of redemption. This idea that, I guess that a traumatic subject can even be fully restored to some kind of wholeness, which to me seems like a lovely fantasy, but also like a really futile one.
One thing that, this piece made me think about is, a project as I go forward, we go forward, is to rethink what we meant by modernity. And that's what we meant by postmodernity. Maybe we were too focused, given our sources, too focused on the city, on industry, on, almost a 19th century problematic, or at least early 20th century problematic about what modernity was. And that made us miss, what counted as modern experience in other parts of the world, other cultures. In a way, we were so focused on the center that we didn't understand in our models of history or models of criticism how the center was so dependent on colonialism and imperialism, and that somehow that's that mistake or that oversight is still inscribed in so many views of what it is to be modern, what it is to be postmodern. I mean, that's begun to change, of course, but people like me, anyway, carry forward that discourse even as we want to revise it. And that's another thing you learn when you look back, is that, there's a project for a person, a project for a cohort, a project for a generation, and you just can't pretend to be in the midst of the next necessary project. You just have to know when to fall silent and let others speak. That's the thing that still plagues me about the anti-aesthetic. One line that runs through it, and it's really stressed by Craig in his extraordinary text on feminism and postmodernism. This great line from Deleuze, the indignity of speaking for others. There's a funny way in which I wish that I had attended to that indignity more in the book as I put it together. But then I was young and I wanted to speak too. And now it's really important, I think at times, but only at times, for people like me to shut the fuck up. But I'll leave it to editors like you to tell us when.
Are there, I guess, younger critics that you're reading today that excite you?
Actually, I love to read people like Zadie Smith, Rachel Kushner, Ben Lerner, Hari Kunzru, many people on art. And that really interests me. But still, what is most important for me when it comes to criticism is to find people who, have a critical position, but also have a relationship to ideas, have a theoretical take too, and also are informed enough about history so they don't make easy mistakes, you know what I mean? So that triangulation of criticism, theory, and history remains a criterion for me when I think about the young critics that I admire. One thing that I think has changed, we've talked about it before, is that writers are, novelists, poets are very involved in art in ways that they weren't back in the day, back in my youth.
I frequently, when I'm speaking to an artist who feels like they haven't been properly considered, or, like somebody's not getting their work, I think, I'm like, well, would we have, for instance, Yvonne Rainer's Trio A today, historically, would anybody have actually gotten it if Yvonne hadn't spelled it out for us?
Yeah, no, Yvonne's another good example.
So brilliantly. Or Adrian Piper with like funk lessons or something, people who, they made the work, but then they knew that it probably wouldn't get traction, or people wouldn't really get it unless they also provided some kind of text. And I don't think that's, I think, of course there's a lot of people who feel like maybe that's a compromise of some kind, but I actually think it's great if like an artist can write smartly about their own work.
Yeah, no, totally. I completely agree. I mean, one thing that did happen though, and this I think goes to explain the trajectory of some, if not most of us, from status as critics to status as academics, is that we were the generation that absorbed a real change in the market. This is just an early indication, again, of neoliberalism. The art market was completely transformed, as you know, in the 1980s, and we saw it happen. And in a way, people like Douglas Craig and I kind of left the magazine world because we thought that it was overwhelmed by the marketplace. So we were going to push into the academy, and it was only then that the academy, became a place that welcomed critical theory and contemporary art. But yeah, there was a displacement. Even though I said that we thought critical theory was the avant-garde, there was a displacement of the critic by, the dealer collector, to put it bluntly, that we weren't the mediators of value anymore, that value was assessed and assigned much more directly. And I think that really, that closed a tap in the critical pipeline, and there was also a way, and I hear this charge to this day, that criticism of our sort was taken up too quickly as history. That on the one hand, criticism was displaced by dealers and collectors. On the other hand, that criticism became academic, that the criticism of that particular period, especially, and here, one thinks of Benjamin Buchloh too, that our critical writing was taken up as an account of the art as historical, that it was turned into the art history of that present preemptively, as if that's what we did or intended. It's hard for me to process. I can't really refute it. Maybe that was true for Greenberg too. Maybe that was true for Steinberg as well. Not to be too pretentious about, associations, but I also think it was really important for us as critics to historicize art. And if that meant that we took on the guise prematurely of the art historian in our art criticism, maybe that's the risk that we wanted to run.